The night the bailiffs arrived at Rothmore House to begin inventorying the furniture for seizure, the Duke of Rothmore expected to find his wife weeping in her rooms, too fragile for the shame of it to bear witness. Instead, he found her rooms empty, her maid unable to say where she'd gone, and it was nearly midnight before he learned that his quiet, unassuming Duchess was 3 streets away, in the private office of the sharpest solicitor in London, dismantling the very crisis he had spent a week hiding from her entirely, because he had assumed, without once actually asking, that she hadn't the constitution to survive knowing the truth. He was about to learn precisely how wrong that assumption had always been. Before we get into how it started, this is a brand new channel, and if you love a man forced to reckon with how badly he misjudged the woman beside him, hit subscribe now so you don't miss what she's capable of. Now, here's how it began. Marcus Ashby, Duke of Rothmore, had chosen his wife with the same careful, deliberate logic he applied to every decision of consequence in his life. And the logic, in the case of his marriage, had been simple. He wanted peace. He had watched his own parents' marriage consume itself over 2 decades of ferocious, exhausting arguments, his mother a woman of formidable will and formidable temper, who had loved his father with the same intensity she brought to every disagreement between them. And Marcus had grown up in a house that rang, far more often than he cared to remember, with raised voices behind closed doors and the particular, bruising silence that followed them. He remembered, with a specificity that had never once faded, standing outside his parents' bedroom door, as a boy of 10, listening to his mother's voice rise and break over some matter of the estate's management his father had apparently decided, without consulting her, the argument circling the same exhausting ground it always seemed to circle. Not the substance of the decision itself, but the fact of having been excluded from it. And Marcus had stood in that corridor understanding, even at 10 years old, that whatever love had once existed between his parents had long since been worn down to something closer to a permanent, wearying negotiation neither of them ever seemed to win. His mother died when he was 21, of a fever that took her within a week, and his father, a man Marcus had always assumed too proud and too weary of conflict to grieve her openly, had simply stopped attending to the estate entirely in the years that followed, retreating into a silence so complete that Marcus sometimes wondered, watching him in those final years, whether his father had spent 2 decades of marriage secretly desperate for exactly the peace his wife's fire had never once allowed him, only to discover, once he finally had it, that the silence left behind was considerably worse than any argument had ever been. Marcus inherited, at 26, both the dukedom and a private, unshakable conviction that a marriage built on strong wills colliding was no marriage at all, merely a slow, mutual ruin, dressed up as passion, and he resolved, watching his father waste away in a grief he'd never once permitted himself to name, that he would build something different for himself entirely. He had courted, before Isabel, a young woman of considerable spirit, named Lady Georgiana Fitzwilliam, drawn to her in his younger years by precisely the fire he would later spend so much effort avoiding, and the courtship had ended badly, in a public argument at a ball that had embarrassed them both, and confirmed, in Marcus's mind, everything he had feared about a marriage built on 2 people determined to have their own way. The argument itself, in later years, struck him as almost laughably small in substance, a disagreement over which of 2 carriages ought to be taken to a dinner engagement, but the ferocity with which both of them had defended their position, in full view of half the county's assembled gentry, had left Marcus shaken in a way the actual disagreement never warranted, certain, in the aftermath, that he had glimpsed the whole future of a marriage to a woman like Georgiana condensed into a single mortifying evening, 2 decades of his own parents' exhausting battles compressed into one carriage and replayed for an audience of gossiping strangers. He resolved, in the years that followed, to marry differently. He wanted a wife who would bring calm rather than storm into his household, someone gentle and unassuming, who would defer to his judgment on the matters he considered properly his to decide, and who would ask for little enough that the marriage might remain, permanently, the peaceful arrangement his own parents had never once managed to be. He spent 3 full seasons searching for precisely such a woman, with the same methodical care he brought to reviewing an estate's accounts, dismissing candidate after candidate for the smallest sign of the fire he had sworn off entirely. A too quick wit, a too firmly held opinion on a matter of politics or fashion, a laugh that carried a fraction too loudly across a drawing room, until his own aunt, exasperated by his growing reputation as impossibly particular, finally insisted he attend a quiet house party, where she promised, with the particular confidence of a woman who had already made up her mind on the matter, that he would find exactly what he claimed to be looking for. Isabel Faircloth seemed, when he was introduced to her at her aunt's insistence, during that quiet house party, 3 years into his search, precisely the woman he had been looking for. She was soft-spoken, careful in her opinions, deferential in a way that struck Marcus, watching her across a series of increasingly promising dinners as a genuine relief after the exhausting fire of Georgiana Fitzwilliam. She rarely argued a point, listened attentively to whatever he chose to discuss, and betrayed, in every visible particular, the quiet, biddable temperament he had decided, years earlier, was the only sensible foundation for a marriage. He proposed within the season, and Isabel, whose own circumstances he understood only in the vaguest, most convenient outline, an orphaned baron's daughter, with 3 younger siblings, and a modest dowry, considerably smaller than his own consequence required, accepted with the same careful, measured composure she brought to every conversation he had ever had with her. What Marcus did not know, because he had never once thought to ask beyond the barest outline his solicitor provided before the settlement was signed, was precisely what that composure had cost Isabel to build, and precisely what it had been forged by. Isabel Faircloth had been 16 years old when a fever swept through her family's modest country house, in the space of a single terrible fortnight, taking both her parents within 3 days of each other, and leaving her, the eldest of 4 children, suddenly and entirely responsible for 2 younger sisters and a brother not yet out of the schoolroom. With an estate mortgaged nearly to its limit and a guardian, her late father's cousin, Mr. Aldous Crane, whose interest in the family's welfare, Isabel discovered within weeks of her parents' funeral, extended only as far as the considerable trustees' commission he stood to earn, managing what remained of the estate's assets, until her brother came of age. Crane was not, in those early months, openly cruel. He was worse, in the particular, patient way of a man who understood precisely how much power the law granted a guardian over children with no other recourse. He installed himself in the running of the household finances within a month of the funeral, and Isabel, watching him quietly siphon funds meant for her siblings' care into accounts she had no legal right to examine, understood with a cold, rapid clarity that she had exactly 2 choices available to her. She could accept the slow, careful ruin Crane was engineering, the eventual sale of the estate's remaining lands, the scattering of her siblings to whatever distant relations or charitable arrangements Crane deemed convenient once their usefulness to him expired, or she could learn, herself, with no one to teach her and no time to spare in the learning, precisely how the law and the ledgers actually worked, and fight him with the only weapons available to a 16-year-old girl with no legal standing of her own. She chose the second course, and spent the following 4 years doing so with a discipline that would have astonished the composed, soft-spoken young woman Marcus later met at that quiet house party, had he ever thought to ask what lay beneath the composure. She taught herself estate law from her late father's own books, staying up long past the hour her siblings slept to work through legal texts far denser than anything a young lady of her station was expected to trouble herself with. She learned to read a ledger with an accountant's precision, catching, within her first full year of study, 3 separate instances of Crane misrepresenting expenditures to the trust and confronting him with the evidence not through open accusation, which she understood instinctively would only harden his resolve and endanger her siblings further, but through a careful, patient campaign of quiet, persistent scrutiny that made clear, without ever raising her voice, that she was watching every entry he made, and would not be easily deceived a second time. There was one confrontation in particular, in the second year of her guardianship, that Isabel would carry with her for the rest of her life, as the precise moment she understood what she had become capable of. Crane, growing impatient with her quiet interference in accounts he had assumed a 16-year-old girl incapable of properly examining, arrived one evening with a solicitor of his own and a proposal to send her youngest sister, not yet 9 years old, to live with a distant cousin in the north, a cousin Isabel had never once heard mentioned before that evening, and who she suspected, correctly as it later proved, existed largely to remove the child from any position to inherit her eventual share of the estate. Isabel had stood in the doorway of her sister's room that night, her voice perfectly level despite the terror closing around her chest, and informed Crane's solicitor, with a precision that startled the man visibly, that she had already retained her own correspondence with a firm in London regarding the exact statutory limits of a guardian's authority to relocate a minor without the consent of an elder sibling acting in loco parentis, and that she would welcome the opportunity to test those limits in open court, along with the full accounting of the trust's expenditures over the preceding 18 months, should Mr. Crane wish to press the matter any further. It was, in truth, a considerable bluff, her actual legal standing considerably murkier than she'd made it sound, but her calm, unwavering delivery left neither man willing to test it, and Crane withdrew the proposal that same evening, never to raise it again. Isabel closed her sister's door, sank down against it in the dark corridor beyond, and wept for the first time in over a year, not from fear, but from the sheer, exhausting relief of having won. She wrote, under a false name, to solicitors in London for advice she could not otherwise have afforded, negotiated directly with creditors twice her age, who initially dismissed her entirely, until her precise, unshakable grasp of the actual figures forced them to reconsider, and stood, on more than one further occasion, between Crane and her youngest sister's future, her voice perfectly level and her spine perfectly straight, informing him in tones of complete, unwavering calm that whatever arrangement he intended, he would find it required considerably more effort to enact than he currently believed. It was this hard, deliberate calm, forged entirely out of necessity, rather than any natural gentleness of temperament, that Marcus mistook, 3 years after Isabel finally won her long battle with Crane, and saw her youngest sibling safely to 16, and legally beyond the man's reach, for simple meekness. She had learned, across 4 grueling years, that the surest way to protect what she loved was to never once let an opponent see the full measure of her resolve until the exact moment it mattered, and she carried that same careful restraint into her marriage without ever once considering that her husband might mistake the restraint for an absence of the will it actually concealed. The early years of their marriage passed in a manner Marcus considered, by his own private measure, a considerable success. There were no raised voices, no public arguments to embarrass either of them, no exhausting battles of will over the running of the household or the estate. Isabel deferred to his judgment on matters of business without complaint, managed the domestic affairs of Rothmore House with a quiet, unremarkable competence that Marcus noted with approval, but never once thought to examine closely, and raised no objection when he made decisions regarding her own settlement, her own allowance, and even the occasional matter concerning her own siblings, without first consulting her at any length. There was, in the marriage's second year, a particular incident that Marcus would only later understand the true weight of, when he arranged, entirely on his own initiative and with what he considered generous intentions, a modest annuity for Isabel's younger brother, without first discussing the sum or its terms with her at all, believing he was simply relieving his wife of a burden she need not trouble herself with. Isabel had thanked him for the gesture with perfect, measured graciousness, and it was not until years later, in the aftermath of the Harlow crisis, that she finally told him how carefully she had, in fact, reviewed every clause of that annuity herself, before allowing her brother to accept it. cross-referencing the terms against her own considerable knowledge of trust law to ensure the arrangement contained none of the hidden entanglements Crane had once used to control her family's finances. A quiet, invisible labor Marcus had never once suspected she was performing beneath her gracious thanks. He told himself, watching their peaceful, orderly household run precisely as he had always hoped a marriage might, that he had chosen correctly, and it did not occur to him, in those early years, to wonder whether Isabel's deference reflected genuine agreement or simply the same hard-won survival instinct that had once kept her alive against Aldous Crane, the understanding that a woman with no legal standing of her own generally fared better conserving her strength for battles that truly mattered than expending it on ones she could not yet win. It was Isabel's younger sister, Charlotte, now grown and settled with a family of her own 2 counties distant, who first gave Marcus the smallest hint of what he had failed to see during a rare visit to Rothmoor in the marriage's 3rd year. The 2 sisters had taken tea in the small back parlour overlooking the gardens, and Marcus, passing the open door on his way to his study, had paused, unnoticed, at the sound of his wife's name spoken with an easy, teasing familiarity he genuinely could not recall ever using with her himself. Charlotte watched her older sister move through the ordinary business of pouring tea with the same careful, deferential quiet Marcus had long since stopped noticing at all, and remarked, once the conversation turned private, that she still found it strange, even after all these years, to watch Isabel hold her tongue so thoroughly in company, when the very same sister had once stood toe-to-toe with a grown man twice her age, and informed him, without a single tremor in her voice, that she would see him in court before she let him touch another shilling of their inheritance. "Do you remember the night with Mr. Crane's solicitor?" Charlotte said, her voice dropping with the particular warmth of a shared, private history. "When you stood in front of my door, like some kind of avenging angel, and I listened through the crack of it, absolutely terrified, and you never once let your voice shake. I have never told your husband that story, Isabel. I sometimes wonder if he'd even believe it, watching you now." Isabel had only smiled, a small, private smile Charlotte recognized from childhood as the particular expression her sister wore when she had decided a battle wasn't yet worth fighting, and changed the subject before either of them could pursue it further, though the exchange lodged itself, unnoticed, in Marcus's memory regardless, overheard by chance through that half-open drawing-room door, filed away without examination, alongside 100 other small details of his wife's life he had never once thought to ask about directly. He did not think of it again, in any serious way, until the spring of the marriage's 4th year, when Rothmoor's finances, managed for over a decade by a steward named Harlow, whom Marcus had inherited along with the title and never once thought to closely examine, began showing the first small, alarming signs of a crisis Marcus did not yet fully understand. Rents were arriving late from tenants who had never before missed a quarter. A shipment of timber, sold at a price that made no sense against the market, left the estate's accounts short by a sum too large to easily explain. A second irregularity followed within the month, a payment to a supplier Marcus had no memory of ever authorizing, and then a third, a loan against the estate's own credit that Harlow explained away with a fluency that might have satisfied a less suspicious man entirely. Marcus, reviewing the ledgers himself for the first time in years, found himself increasingly certain that Harlow had been doing to Rothmoor precisely what Aldous Crane had once attempted against Isabel's own family, though he did not yet know the parallel existed, quietly bleeding an estate whose master had grown too comfortable in his own peaceful, well-ordered life to notice the theft accumulating beneath it. Marcus made the decision, in the weeks that followed, to keep the growing severity of the crisis entirely from Isabel. He told himself he was protecting her from unnecessary worry, the same careful, deliberate logic that had governed every decision of their marriage, that a gentle temperament such as hers had no need to be burdened with the ugly business of confronting a thieving steward, and the very real possibility, as the figures grew steadily worse across that spring, that Rothmoor's finances might not survive the summer intact. He met with solicitors alone, choosing deliberately not to retain the one man in London whose reputation might actually have served him, a Mr. Gideon Ashworth, because Ashworth's fees struck Marcus in his determination to manage the crisis quietly and without alarming his household, as an unnecessary expense for a matter he was still convinced he could resolve on his own authority. He wrote to his bank alone. He said nothing to Isabel beyond a vague, reassuring dismissal whenever she asked, with a quiet, careful attentiveness he mistook for simple wifely concern, rather than the sharp, trained instinct of a woman who had once caught a guardian's fraud from smaller irregularities than the ones now accumulating in her own household's accounts. It was Isabel herself, reviewing the household expenditure ledgers she had always quietly kept, entirely on her own initiative and entirely without her husband's knowledge, who first understood the true scale of what was happening, weeks before Marcus finally worked up the courage to tell her anything at all. She recognized the pattern immediately, the same careful, incremental theft she had spent 4 years of her girlhood learning to detect, and she began, with the same patient, unhurried discipline that had once undone Aldous Crane, her own quiet investigation of Harlow's accounts. Cross-referencing figures Marcus had never once thought to share with her against household records she had access to through her own management of the domestic budget, building a case against the steward with a thoroughness that would have stunned her husband had he thought, even for a moment, that she was capable of it. She worked at it in the evenings, after Marcus had retired to his own study, with the same careful, closed expression he'd worn for weeks, requesting copies of tenancy records through a clerk she'd quietly cultivated a friendly acquaintance with, cross-checking Harlow's reported timber sales against the actual market rates she remembered from her own years managing her father's smaller estate, and within a fortnight she possessed a case against the steward considerably more complete than anything her husband's solicitors had yet assembled, though she said nothing of it to Marcus, watching him grow paler and more distant with each passing week, understanding, with a familiar, weary patience, that he had once again decided this was a battle to be fought alone, and choosing, as she had learned to choose so many years before, to build her own solution quietly, rather than force an argument she wasn't yet certain she could win. The crisis reached its breaking point on an evening in early summer, when Harlow, sensing the walls closing in around him, made a final, desperate attempt to liquidate what remained of the estate's more portable assets before Marcus's growing suspicion could be formalized into action, forging authorization for the sale of a considerable quantity of silver and calling in debts against the estate that sent a pair of bailiffs to Rothmore's front door with orders to begin inventorying furniture against a fraudulent claim of unpaid obligation. Marcus, arriving home to find the bailiffs already at work in his own front hall, felt the particular, sick vertigo of a man watching a crisis he had spent months quietly managing spiral, in a single evening, entirely beyond his control, and his first instinct, even in that moment of genuine panic, was to send word to Isabel's rooms that she was to remain there, undisturbed, while he dealt with the matter himself. It was only when her maid informed him, with visible confusion, that the Duchess had left the house nearly 2 hours earlier and given no indication of when she intended to return, that Marcus understood, for the first time in 4 years of marriage, that his wife had apparently been managing something of her own the entire evening, without a single word to him about it. He found her, close to midnight, in the private office of Mr. Gideon Ashworth, the sharpest and most expensive solicitor in London, a man Marcus himself had considered retaining but dismissed as too costly for what he'd assumed was a matter he could manage quietly on his own. Isabel sat across the desk from Ashworth with a stack of documents in front of her that Marcus recognized, with a jolt of genuine astonishment, as copies of Harlow's forged authorizations, annotated in a precise, careful hand, with figures and dates that laid the entire scheme bare in a manner considerably more thorough than anything Marcus's own quiet inquiries had managed across the preceding months. "Your Grace," Isabel said, glancing up at him with none of the fragile alarm he had, somewhere in the depths of his assumptions, half expected to find. I was going to send word within the hour. Mr. Ashworth has agreed to have the bailiff's claim formally challenged first thing tomorrow morning, on the grounds that Harlow's authorization is demonstrably fraudulent, and I have already written to your bank confirming that the silver in question was never legally released for sale at all. The bailiffs will find, once Mr. Ashworth's letter reaches them tonight, that they've been made instruments of a theft rather than the recovery of a genuine debt, and I would expect them gone from the house by morning. Marcus stood in the doorway of a solicitor's office at midnight, staring at his wife of 4 years, as though seeing her, for the very first time, in full and unobstructed light. "You knew," he said slowly. "You knew about Harlow. How long?" 3 weeks, Isabel said, setting down her pen with the same unhurried composure she brought to every conversation he had ever had with her, though something in her expression, some careful guardedness he had genuinely never noticed before, told him she was watching his reaction with considerably more attention than her voice suggested. "I recognized the pattern in the household accounts before you ever mentioned a single concern to me, Your Grace. I said nothing because you gave me no opening to say anything, and I have learned, across a great many years now, that offering unrequested opinions to a man determined to manage a crisis alone generally accomplishes nothing beyond making the woman offering them appear hysterical or overreaching. I decided it was more useful to simply solve the problem quietly and present you with the solution once it was ready, rather than argue with you about whether I was capable of understanding the problem in the first place." "Where did you learn to do this?" Marcus asked, gesturing helplessly at the annotated documents spread across Ashworth's desk, at the precise, confident authority with which she had clearly spent the entire evening directing a solicitor Marcus himself had never dared retain.
"Isabel, I have known you for 4 years, and I did not know a single part of what I am watching right now."
Mr. Ashworth, sensing the conversation had moved well beyond matters requiring his own presence, murmured something about preparing the morning's correspondence, and withdrew to an adjoining room, leaving husband and wife alone amid the scattered evidence of a crisis Isabel had solved almost entirely without her husband's knowledge. Isabel was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally answered, her voice carried a weight Marcus had genuinely never heard in it before. 4 years of careful, deliberate restraint, finally cracking open in the exhausted aftermath of a crisis she had spent 3 weeks managing entirely alone. "My parents died of a fever when I was 16, Your Grace," she said. "I did not tell you the whole of what came after, because you never once asked beyond the barest facts your solicitor provided before our settlement was signed, and because I learned, very early in my life, that a woman's strength is rarely welcomed by the men around her nearly so warmly as her softness is. My father's cousin was appointed our guardian, and he spent the better part of 2 years quietly stealing from an estate meant to support 3 children considerably younger than myself, and I taught myself, alone, with no one to guide me and no time to spare in the learning, precisely how to fight him, using nothing but the law itself, because it was the only weapon available to a girl with no other standing in the world. I have not forgotten a single skill that fight taught me, Marcus. I have simply never once been given a reason, in 4 years of marriage, to believe you wanted to see any of it." Marcus said nothing for a long moment, the full weight of 4 years of quiet, comfortable assumption settling over him with a force considerably heavier than the crisis with Harlow had managed to produce. "I chose you," he said finally, his voice rough, "because you were quiet, because you never argued with me. I watched my own parents destroy each other over 2 decades of exactly the kind of fire I thought I was avoiding by marrying someone gentle, and I told myself your calm was simply your nature, and never once considered that it might be something you built, brick by brick, out of the wreckage of surviving something I knew absolutely nothing about." "It was never an absence of fire, Your Grace," Isabel said quietly. "It was simply fire I had learned, very young, to spend only where it actually mattered. I am not weak. I have never once, in my entire life, been weak. I have simply been careful about where I chose to show you strength, because you built our entire marriage on the assumption that I possessed none, and I did not know, until tonight, whether correcting that assumption would cost me more than it would gain. They rode home together in silence, the carriage rattling through empty London streets in the small hours before dawn, and Marcus spent the whole of that ride turning over, with a discomfort he had rarely allowed himself to feel. Every small decision of their marriage he had made without once thinking to consult her, the annuity for her brother, the household allowances he'd set without discussion, the countless quiet moments in 4 years when he had spoken over her opinion or simply never asked for it at all, each memory landing with a fresh, specific weight now that he understood precisely what capability had been sitting quietly beside him through every single one of them. The following weeks unraveled the full scope of what Harlow had done, and it was Isabel, working alongside Mr. Ashworth with a fluency in estate law that left the solicitor himself openly impressed within their first joint meeting, who took the lead in dismantling the steward's fraud entirely, tracing every falsified account back to its origin with the same patient, methodical precision she had once turned against Aldous Crane. Marcus, present at every meeting she permitted him to attend, found himself in the strange, humbling position of watching his own wife manage a crisis considerably more complex than anything he had faced alone in his years as Duke, and understood, with each passing week, precisely how much of their marriage's peaceful surface he had built on a foundation of never once asking what lay beneath it. There was an evening, once Harlow had finally been dismissed and formally prosecuted, and the estate's finances set firmly back in order, when Marcus found Isabel in the estate's private library, reviewing, entirely of her own initiative, the quarterly accounts of Rothmore's tenant farms, with the same careful attention she'd once brought to Crane's fraudulent ledgers. He sat down across from her without a word, and simply watched her work for a long while, and when she finally looked up, clearly expecting some further discomfort from him at the sight of his wife handling business he had once considered entirely his own, he surprised her instead by asking, plainly and without a trace of his old careful management, what she thought of the Eastern tenancy's declining yield, a question he had genuinely never once asked her opinion on before that evening. Isabel studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the particular kind of testing he had, without ever meaning to, subjected her to throughout their marriage, and found, apparently, something different there instead, and answered him at length, walking him through the soil records she'd quietly requested from his own steward's replacement weeks earlier, comparing them against rainfall patterns she'd tracked in a private notebook Marcus had never once noticed her keeping, and arriving, by the end of a conversation that ran well past midnight, at a proposal for crop rotation considerably more sophisticated than anything his own agricultural advisors had suggested in years. Marcus found himself, by the fire's dying light, not merely informed, but genuinely delighted, in a way he had not expected and did not entirely know how to name, watching his wife's face come alive with an animation he had somehow never once witnessed in 4 years of marriage, her hands gesturing over the ledger with a confidence that made her, he thought with a sudden, startling clarity, considerably more beautiful than the careful, composed woman he had originally married. "You never once looked at me like this before tonight," Isabel observed, catching him watching her rather than the ledger. "I never once saw you before tonight," Marcus admitted. "I saw the wife I had decided to want, and mistook her for the whole of who you actually were." "I chose you because I thought you were gentle," Marcus said, some time later, watching her make a final note in the margin of a ledger that would, within the month, considerably improve the Eastern tenancy's fortunes. "I understand now that gentleness was never actually the thing I chose. I chose someone who had already survived a war I knew nothing about, and simply mistook the peace on the other side of it for an absence of the fight that won it. I am sorry, Isabel, not merely for Harlow, though I should have trusted you weeks sooner than I did. I am sorry for 4 years of never once asking who you actually were, beneath the composure I found so convenient." Isabel set down her pen and looked at him for a long moment, something in her expression finally, fully unguarded in a way Marcus had genuinely never once seen from her across the whole of their marriage. "Then ask me now," she said simply. He did, that evening and every evening after, and the marriage that emerged from the wreckage of Harlow's fraud bore only a surface resemblance to the quiet, peaceful arrangement Marcus had once believed he'd built. It was, if anything, considerably louder, filled now with genuine arguments over estate matters that Isabel no longer felt obliged to concede simply for the sake of preserving an artificial calm, filled with the particular, exhausting, entirely worthwhile friction of two people who had finally stopped managing each other and started, for the first time, actually working alongside one another. Marcus found, to his own considerable surprise, that he did not mind the noise nearly so much as his younger self had once feared he would, having learned, at last, that the fire he'd spent years avoiding in his parents' marriage and the strength his own wife had spent a lifetime learning to wield were never, in truth, the same thing at all. It was some months later, at a county assembly neither Marcus nor Isabel had particularly wished to attend, that Aldous Crane himself, older now and considerably diminished in the years since Isabel had last stood against him, approached the couple with the same oily, presumptuous familiarity he had once used to install himself in a grieving household's finances. He had heard, he said, offering Isabel a bow she did not return, of her husband's recent troubles with a dishonest steward, and could not resist observing, with a thin smile that fooled no one in earshot, that some women seemed simply destined to find themselves surrounded by men who underestimated them. "You would know better than most, Mr. Crane," Isabel said, her voice carrying easily across the small circle of guests who had drawn near enough to listen, the same perfectly level tone she had once used against his solicitor in a dark corridor outside her sister's door. Precisely how costly that particular mistake tends to prove for the man who makes it. "I trust Rothmore's steward will find prison considerably less comfortable than the commission you once hoped to collect managing my late father's estate, though I understand you never did quite manage to collect the whole of it in the end." Crane's smile faltered, the color rising unpleasantly in his face as the small crowd's attention shifted, with the particular relish of assembled gossips, fully onto him, and he made his excuses and withdrew within the minute, never to trouble either of them again. Marcus, standing beside his wife with a hand resting, unbidden, at the small of her back, felt something close to pride settle over him, considerably different from the careful, managed approval he had once mistaken for the whole of what a marriage required. If watching a proud man finally see the full measure of the woman he'd spent years underestimating left you cheering, you know exactly what to do. This channel is brand new, and every subscriber genuinely helps us keep telling stories like this one, so if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss the next release. Give this one a like if Isabel deserved every bit of that midnight reckoning. Share it with someone who loves a quiet heroine turning out to be the strongest person in the room, and let me know in the comments the exact moment you realized Marcus had no idea who he'd actually married.